In 1997, a heroin-addicted girl steals Bill Gates' wallet and the last photo of his late mother inside. A decade later, the billionaire tracks her down, discovering she clung to the photo as a lifeline to quit drugs. His revenge? Fun or rehab? Her redemption? Led a global fight against addiction. A stolen moment becomes a bridge between a tech titan's grief and a thief's shattered hope. What binds them? A faded Polaroid, a secret pact with the past, and a chance to rewrite their legacies. Sometimes theft isn't a crime. It's a cry for salvation. Stay to uncover how one stolen photo changed two lives forever. And don't forget to subscribe. Seattle in 1997 was a city of fractured light. Glass towers clawed at the sky, their reflections fracturing in the rain-slicked streets below, while in the alleyways, shadows pooled like spilled ink. On an evening thick with the promise of winter, Bill Gates stood at the periphery of a charity gala, his smile a mask welded to ambition. At 41, he had conquered the binary world of ones and zeros, but grief defied logic. His mother, Mary, had died months earlier, her absence a hollow in his chest he could not name. That night, amid chatter of philanthropy and patents, he'd excused himself, retreating to an alley where the rain fell in needles, sharp and impersonal. He didn't see her. Clara, 22, was a ghost in a thrift store coat, her bones sharp beneath skin the color of old paper. Heroin had sanded her life to a single compulsion: move, steal, survive. She'd trailed Gates from the gala's glow, her steps soundless, her breath a ragged metronome. When her fingers brushed his coat, it wasn't malice that guided her, only the arithmetic of addiction. The wallet slipped free, warm leather against her palm, and she dissolved into the gloom before he noticed the weight missing from his hip. Inside, Gates patted his pocket. Gone. He shrugged it off. Cash and cards were ephemera. But later, in the silence of his town car, memory struck like a blade. The Polaroid tucked behind his driver's license. A snapshot of his mother at Hood Canal, her laugh caught mid-frame, the inscription on the back in her looping hand. To Bill, who never stops moving. Love, Mom. He'd carried it since her diagnosis, a silent vow to outrun time. Now it was gone, and the loss felt like losing her twice. Across the city, Clara crouched beneath a flickering street lamp, counting bills with shaking hands. $200. A credit card she'd never dare use. And the photo, Mary Gates' face luminous under the sickly yellow light. Clara's dealer, a specter with knuckles tattooed, live/evil, snorted as she handed him the cash. Sentimental? He sneered, nodding at the Polaroid crumpled in her grip. Shut up, she hissed. That night, in a basement that reeked of mold and hopelessness, she pinned the photo to a wall stained with watermarks. The heroin burned through her veins, but Mary's gaze cut through the haze, steady, unflinching. Clara had stolen 100 wallets from 100 strangers, but this was different. The woman's smile haunted her, a reproachful saint in a roach-infested shrine. Days blurred. Gates buried himself in boardrooms, the photo's absence a silent throb beneath spreadsheets and stock surges. Clara, meanwhile, began to resent the Polaroid. It judged her from the wall as she cooked her fix, its warmth a mockery. One night, she tore it down, matches in hand. But as the flame kissed the edge, she froze. Mary's face warped in the heat, and suddenly Clara was a child again, kneeling in a church pew beside her own mother, long dead, her voice a whisper. Angels hide in plain sight, baby. Don't ever stop looking. The photo survived, hidden in a cracker tin beneath her bed. By December, the money was ash. Clara pawned the wallet at a shop on 3rd Avenue, its owner squinting at the initials WHE3. Rich man's toy, he muttered, tossing her $50. She kept the Polaroid, its edges frayed from her restless fingers. Winter iced the streets, and Gates, in his mansion overlooking the Sound, found himself humming lullabies his mother had sung, tunes he'd forgotten he knew. Clara, hunched in a bus shelter, traced Mary's face through the plastic of her Ziploc talisman. Neither knew it yet, but the theft had fused their fates, a thief and a titan, tethered by a stolen sliver of grace. The winter of 1997 clung to Seattle like a fever, its icy breath seeping into the cracks of both skyscrapers and tenements. For Bill Gates, the season brought no respite. By day, he navigated boardrooms where the air hummed with the static of progress. Stock projections flickered on screens. Mergers were dissected like equations, and the future was an algorithm to be optimized. But at night, in the quiet of his study, the void left by the stolen Polaroid yawned wide. He'd begun to dream of his mother's hands, folding laundry, turning the pages of The Great Gatsby, gripping his own fingers as the morphine drip blurred her voice. He woke each morning to a world that demanded his genius but ignored his grief. He tried to recreate the photo. A team of discreet archivists combed through family albums, digitizing every image of Mary they could find. The result was a pristine slideshow on his laptop. Pixels in place of paper, resolution instead of resonance. It wasn't the same. The Polaroid had been a relic, its edges softened by his touch, its colors fading like her laughter. Now, her face glared at him from the screen, flawless and foreign. He closed the laptop, the click echoing in the dark. Across the city, Clara's world had shrunk to 4 walls and a single window crusted with grime. The $50 from the pawned wallet bought her a week of oblivion, but the heroin no longer worked as it once did. The high was a frayed rope, snapping too soon, dropping her back into a reality where Mary Gates' photo glared from the cracker tin like a reproachful ghost. She'd begun talking to it, slurred confessions in the pre-dawn hours. "I'm sorry," she'd whisper, tracing the woman's face with a trembling finger. "I'm sorry I'm not her." One morning, she woke to the sound of her own retching. Her body had turned traitor, muscles knotting, skin slick with sweat. Withdrawal. She curled on the floor, the photo clutched to her chest, and thought of her mother, a waitress with Mary's same laugh lines. Dead at 34 from a needle she'd sworn was clean. "You're better than this," her mother had told her once, scrubbing meth off a diner booth. Clara hadn't believed her then. Now, with Mary's eyes boring into her, she almost did. She lasted 3 days. By the 4th, she stumbled into a methadone clinic, the Polaroid hidden in her sleeve like a prayer card. The nurse handed her a paper cup of cloudy liquid, and for a heartbeat, Clara felt hope, a fragile thing, like the first green shoot after a forest fire. But the clinic closed at 5, and the streets outside swarmed with dealers. By midnight, she was back in her basement, the syringes bite a familiar penance. Mary's face watched from the wall, silent. Gates, meanwhile, found himself stranded in a different kind of purgatory. At a family dinner in Medina, his daughter's 3rd birthday, he sat motionless as she smashed chocolate cake into her hair, giggling. His wife's laughter rang like a bell, but he couldn't join in. All he saw was his mother's hands again, how they'd steadied his own small fingers on the piano keys, how they'd waved from the porch as he left for Harvard. "Don't work too hard," she called. He'd rolled his eyes. Now, he'd give $1 billion to hear her say it once more. He began leaving meetings early. His driver would find him at the Seattle Public Library, poring over old newspapers in the microfiche room. June 10th, 1994, Mary's obituary. He read it until the words blurred, then wandered the stacks, trailing his fingers over book spines. Once, in the philosophy section, he pulled out a dog-eared copy of Man's Search for Meaning and found a Polaroid tucked inside, a stranger's graduation photo. He slid it back, his throat tight. Clara's relapses became rituals. She'd pawn her coat for a hit, then retrieve it days later, shivering in a stolen sweatshirt. The Polaroid migrated from the wall to her pillow, then to the soul-clean patch of floor. One night, in a rage, she flung it into a corner. It landed face up, Mary's smile serene amid the trash. Clara screamed, hurled a jar of peanut butter mist. The glass shattered, and suddenly she was sobbing, picking shard from the photo with bloody fingers. "I'm trying," she choked. "Can't you see I'm trying?" By spring, Gates' grief had ossified into something harder. He greenlit a new campus in Redmond, its blueprints sprawling across his desk like a city of the future. Let them call him ruthless. Let them sue. If he couldn't outrun the past, he'd bury it under steel and glass. But in rare moments, staring at the sound from his office window or watching his daughter stack blocks with single-minded focus, he'd feel the ghost of the Polaroid in his breast pocket, a weight he couldn't shed. Clara, meanwhile, discovered a talent for vanishing. She drifted between shelters, rehab attempts, and the streets, the photo now sealed in a Ziploc and tucked in her bra. It became a compass, though she didn't know north from oblivion. One evening, under a bridge strung with fairy lights, a city initiative to beautify homelessness, she met a girl named Liza, 19 and newly addicted, who marveled at the Polaroid. "She looks like my grandma," Liza said. Clara snorted. "She's nobody's grandma." But later, as Liza nodded off against her shoulder, Clara studied the photo anew. Mary's eyes held no judgment, only a quiet persistence, the same look Clara's mother had worn scrubbing that diner booth. For the first time, she wondered whose hands had held the camera, whose voice had made Mary laugh. The question lingered, sharp as a splinter. When the cops raided the bridge at dawn, Clara ran, the photo pressed to her ribs. She didn't look back. Time, in the end, is neither linear nor kind. By 2005, the world had spun forward. Dot-com bubbles burst, towers fell, and a new hunger for connection pulsed through fiber optic veins. Bill Gates, now 49, had learned to wear his grief like a tailored suit. Invisible seams, impeccable fabric. Fatherhood had softened the edges of his ambition. He lingered longer at bedtime stories, marveled at the way his children's laughter could fracture the armor of his day. But the Polaroid remained a phantom itch, a scar he'd trace absently during investor calls. It resurfaced on a Tuesday. His assistant, a woman named Elena with a mind like a search algorithm, had been tasked with digitizing decades of his family's ephemera. Birth certificates, report cards, the detritus of a life lived in public. A subroutine flagged an anomaly, a pawn shop database entry from 1997, scanned and forgotten. Vintage Polaroid. Inscription. To Bill, who never stops moving. Love, Mom. The shop's address glowed on her screen. 3rd Avenue, a street Gates hadn't walked since the theft. He stood at his office window, the sound churning below. 8 years. The photo had outlived operating systems, outlasted marriages of convenience between tech giants. He imagined it tucked in a stranger's drawer, smudged by indifferent fingers. But when he closed his eyes, he saw Clara, not as a thief, but as a blur in the rain, a shadow he'd failed to notice. "Find her," he told Elena, his voice steady. Quietly, Clara, at 30, had become a student of small salvations. Mornings began at 5 a.m. in a studio apartment that smelled of bleach and determination. She'd brew coffee, count her pills, green for anxiety, white for cravings, and lace her sneakers with military precision. The Polaroid lived in her wallet now, its edges laminated, Mary's smile preserved under plastic. She worked nights at a rehab center called Harbor Light, mopping floors and stocking naloxone kits. The clients called her a ghost, a nod to her pallor, her silence, the way she moved through the fluorescent halls like a rumor. She'd been clean for 14 months, 6 days. The numbers were etched into her ribs, a ledger of near misses. On bad days, she'd lock herself in the supply closet, press the photo to her sternum, and recite Mary's inscription like a rosary. Never stops moving. It had become her mantra, though she'd long since stopped wondering about the man who'd written it. Her life was a mosaic of routines, subway rides where she avoided eye contact, grocery runs timed to the minute, the relentless scrubbing of her hands until the skin cracked. Stability, she'd learned, was a cage built of minutiae. But some nights, when the center's detox ward echoed with screams, she'd catch her reflection in a window and see the girl from the alley, hollow-eyed, hungry, still one bad decision from collapse. The private investigator was a former cop named Vargas with a fondness for crossword puzzles and bourbon. He started at the pawn shop, its owner long dead, ledgers dusty as ash. The trail was cold, but Vargas had a nose for desperation. He tracked the wallet serial number to a methadone clinic in Ballard, Its records a patchwork of aliases and half-truths. A nurse with nicotine stains on her fingers remembered a girl. Skinny, quiet, always clutching some photo. Vargas pieced together Clara's orbit, shelters, court dates, a 6-month stint in a county jail. Her face materialized in a mugshot. 2001, eyes blackened, hair matted. Gates studied the image in his study, his daughter asleep down the hall. The woman in the photo was a stranger, yet her defiance mirrored his own. The same clenched jaw he'd seen in early press shots, battling antitrust suits. She's at Harbor Light, Vargas said, sliding a grainy surveillance photo across the desk. Clara, caught mid-stride, her posture taut as a wire. Gates hesitated. Closure, he'd told himself, was the goal. But beneath the pragmatism hummed a darker curiosity. Why keep it? The question gnawed, a splinter in the myth of his own control. Clara felt the eyes first. It began as a prickle at her nape, a sensation she'd learned to trust during her years on the streets. She spotted the sedan outside Harbor Light, its windows tinted, engine idling. Paranoia, she told herself. But days later, Vargas approached her at a bus stop, his voice a low rumble. Mr. Gates would like to meet. She ran, not out of fear but shame. The Polaroid burned in her wallet, a stolen relic. She changed routes, slept in the center storage room, ate protein bars from vending machines. But Gates was patient. He'd built empires by outlasting resistance. They met in a diner off Aurora Avenue, its vinyl booths cracked, coffee bitter as regret. Clara arrived early, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, Mary's photo on the table between them. Gates paused in the doorway, struck by the dissonance. The woman from the mugshot, now all sharp angles and guarded grace, sitting beneath a flickering no loitering sign. He slid into the booth. No bodyguards, no pretense. For a long moment, they studied each other. The thief who'd clung to a ghost, the titan who'd chased one. You kept her, he said finally, nodding at the Polaroid. Clara's thumb brushed the laminate. She kept me. The admission hung between them, raw and unadorned. Gates reached for the photo, then stopped. It wasn't his anymore. Somewhere in the decade-long chase, ownership had blurred, the image now a shared artifact, a bridge between a basement and a boardroom. He left without it. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed like trapped insects, casting a sickly pallor over the Formica table where Clara sat, her spine rigid against the vinyl booth. She'd chosen the seat facing the door, old habits, and now regretted it as Bill Gates stepped inside, his silhouette momentarily backlit by the sodium glare of Aurora Avenue. He moved differently than she'd imagined. On magazine covers, he was all angles and intent, a man dissecting the future with a scalpel gaze. Here, he seemed smaller, his shoulders rounded under a nondescript fleece jacket, his hands shoved into pockets as if unsure of their purpose. He paused, scanning the room, and for a heartbeat Clara considered bolting. But the Polaroid lay between them, Mary's smile fossilized under laminate, and she found herself pinned by its gravity. He slid into the booth without ceremony. Up close, his face was a map of contradictions. Crow's feet softened by fatherhood, a mouth that defaulted to a frown when unobserved. His eyes flicked to the photo, then to her hands, chapped from bleach and winter air, gripping her teacup like a lifeline. She waited for anger, for the cold calculus of a billionaire wronged. Instead, he reached for the sugar shaker, his wedding band clinking against glass, and poured a careful mound onto the table. I used to do this at Harvard, he said, his voice quieter than she'd expected. When I couldn't sleep, building pyramids. He traced a finger through the granules, shaping slopes. Clara said nothing. Let him talk. Let him fill the silence with whatever script he'd rehearsed. But Gates fell quiet, studying his makeshift monument. The diner's hum expanded, the fryer's sizzle, a trucker's raspy cough at the counter, the drip of a faulty faucet. When he finally spoke again, it wasn't about the wallet or the money or even the photo. She hated sugar, he said. My mother made us eat carob cookies. Tasted like dirt. A faint smile. But she'd let me steal spoonfuls when my father wasn't looking. Clara's throat tightened. She prepared for threats, for lawyers, for the cold machinery of justice. Not this. This unguarded intimacy, this offering of a memory she hadn't stolen. Her finger found the edge of the Polaroid, tracing the ridge where the laminate met air. Why? The word slipped out, sharp as a shiv. Why look for me? He hesitated, demolishing the sugar pyramid with a tap. I thought I wanted the photo back. His gaze drifted to the window, where rain sketched rivulets down the glass. Turns out I just needed to know it mattered. A waitress appeared, refilling their mugs. Clara watched the steam curl upward, dissolving into the charged space between them. She thought of the countless nights she'd whispered to Mary's image, spinning fantasies of the woman's life. Sunday dinners, garden parties, a son who came home. Now, faced with the man who'd inherited that son's grief, she felt the flimsiness of her own narrative. The photo hadn't been a window into Mary's world. It was a mirror, reflecting back the mother she'd failed, the daughter she'd never become. Gates pulled a folded check from his pocket, sliding it across the table. Clara didn't need to look to know the sum would be obscene. Rehab, he said. Any facility. Nostrin spunto. She pushed it back, her pulse a dull roar. I'm clean. You're surviving, he corrected, gentle as a surgeon. There's a difference. The check trembled between them, a leaf on a wire. Clara imagined cashing it, the crisp weight of new bills, the sweet oblivion they'd buy. One call to her old dealer, and she'd vanish into a haze where Mary's face couldn't reach her. But then Gates did something unexpected. He reached out, not for the photo, but for her wrist. His touch was brief, warm, paternal. Keep her, he said, nodding at the Polaroid. She's better with you. When he left, the bell above the door jingling like a taunt, Clara sat frozen. The check remained, unsigned, a blank space where his name should have been. She tore it into confetti, scattering the pieces into her tea. Let him think her ungrateful. Let him wonder. Gates returned to his office, the diner's grease lingering on his clothes. He drafted an email to Elena, find the best rehab centers. Discreetly, then deleted it. Clara's defiance had been familiar, a reflection of his own younger self, all pride and jagged edges. He'd seen in the mirror during the antitrust battles, the nights he'd coded through dawn to prove he didn't need sleep or approval or anyone. He took the long route home that night, his driver winding through Capitol Hill's tangled streets. Outside a methadone clinic, a woman hunched under a foil blanket caught his eye, gaunt, shivering, her face a cipher. He imagined Clara there, 8 years younger, her hands clutching Mary's photo like a rosary. When his daughter asked why he was late, he invented a meeting. Some lies were kinder than the truth. Clara lasted 3 weeks. The craving began as an itch in her teeth, a restlessness in her marrow. Harbor Light's clients relapsed around her, their sobs echoing through thin walls. One night, she found a syringe in the alley behind the center, its plunger cocked like a dare. She pocketed it, telling herself she'd dispose of it safely. But the weight in her jacket became a lodestone, pulling her toward the bridge where Liza still camped. Ghost! Liza grinned, her teeth gray at the roots. Got something good? Clara hesitated. The syringe burned against her ribs. Then, from her wallet, Mary's face peeked out, smiling, eternal. She tossed the syringe into the river. Nah, Chelit. Just checking in. The next morning, she called the number on the business card Vargas had slipped her. The rehab facility was a converted lodge in the Cascades, its windows framing pines that pierced the clouds. Clara's room had a quilt, a desk, and a lockbox for the Polaroid. She had nothing else. Detox was a live wire. She dreamt of Gates' sugar pyramids collapsing, of Mary spooning carob into a child's mouth. Once, she woke screaming, convinced her skin was crawling with ants. A counselor named Derek, himself a decade clean, sat with her until dawn. Guilt's a slow poison, he said. You gotta bleed it out. She wrote letters she never sent. Dear Mary, I'm sorry I failed you. Dear Mom, I'm sorry I became you. Dear Bill, I'm sorry I'm not her. The lockbox swelled with pages. Gates followed her progress through coded reports. Subject completed 30 days. Subject relapsed. Subject recommitted. He stopped reading after the third relapse, ashamed of his own voyeurism. Instead, he funded a naloxone vending machine outside Harbor Light, its sleek design incongruous against the graffiti. 2 years unspooled. Clara earned her counseling certificate, her hands steady now as she calibrated doses for trembling clients. The Polaroid hung above her desk, its laminate yellowing. Teens fresh from the streets would ask, "That your grandma?" Something like that, she'd say. Gates, meanwhile, found himself volunteering at a youth coding camp. The kids didn't care about empires. They asked about his watch, his sneakers, whether he'd ever beaten Halo. One boy, Javier, stuck late debugging a game, mentioned his sister's overdose. Gates drove him home that night, past the clinic with his machine glowing in the dark. "You ever lose someone?" Javier asked, the car idling outside a boarded-up duplex. Gates glanced at the Polaroid replica in his wallet, digitized, perfect, soulless. "Yes," he said, "but she keeps finding me." When Clara's graduation invite arrived, a generic email about a Phoenix Initiative launch, Gates debated. Curiosity won. He sat in the back row, hat pulled low, as she took the podium. Her hair was longer, streaked with gray, her voice rough but resonant. "They say addiction is a thief," she said. "But sometimes it's the thing that's stolen from you. Your voice, your choices, your hope." She touched the pendant at her throat, a tiny photo charm, Mary's face barely visible. Recovery isn't about getting back what you lost. It's about making peace with what remains. Afterward, he lingered by the refreshments, a paper cup of punch in hand. Clara materialized beside him, her presence calm as a settled tide. "You came." He nodded. She'd have liked this. The helping. Clara's smile was weary-wise. "You ever think about why she let me keep it?" The photo. He had. In boardrooms, at red lights, during piano recitals. "Maybe she knew I needed the reminder," he said. "Or maybe," Clara said, glancing at the pendant, "she knew I needed the proof." They stood in silence, the unspoken hovering like a specter. Around them, the crowd buzzed. Donors, survivors, reporters. But in that sliver of stillness, the past felt navigable, almost kind. Gates left before the speeches ended. The photo's weight lighter now, as if Clara had carried it long enough for them both. The cascades held their breath in the blue hour before dawn, frost etching cryptic patterns on the windows of the Phoenix Initiative. Clara, now 34, stood in the facility's communal kitchen, grinding coffee beans with the methodical intensity of someone calibrating a time bomb. Her hands, once cracked from bleach and winter, bore new calluses, from gripping steering wheels during midnight crisis calls, from hauling donated mattresses, from clasping the wrists of trembling teenagers mid-panic attack. The Polaroid hung in her office, framed beside her counseling certificate, its edges fraying like the hem of a well-loved shroud. Her days were a mosaic of mundanity and miracles. Mornings began with inventory, naloxone kits, hygiene packs, the ever-dwindling stock of granola bars. Afternoons blurred into intake sessions where kids with septum piercings and hollow eyes spun lies as flimsy as cobwebs. Nights were for outreach, street corners under sodium lamps, backpacks heavy with hope and sterile needles. She developed a sixth sense for the moment before collapse. The hitch in a breath, the glassy stare, the way a body listed like a ship taking on water. It was the quiet moments that undid her. A girl named Destiny, 17 and 5 days clean, tracing Mary's face in the Polaroid. "She looks tired," Destiny murmured. Clara said nothing. The photo had yellowed, Mary's smile now a ghostly curve, but the inscription remained legible, "Never stops moving." Gates' involvement was a shadow presence. Checks arrived quarterly and signed, laundered through shell foundations. He'd funded the photo charm pendants, stainless steel lockets containing replicas of the Polaroid, given to graduates. Clara wore hers out of habit, the metal warm against her sternum. She wondered if he knew how often she'd pawned it in the early years, only to retrieve it, shame-faced, before dawn. Relapse came on a Tuesday. A client overdosed in the bathroom. A boy named Eli with a skateboard and a gap-toothed grin. Clara found him slumped against the tiles, his lips cyanotic, the needle still dangling from a vein. She administered naloxone, her hands steady, her mind a white noise roar. That night, she drove to a gas station off I-5, bought a burner phone, and dialed a number she'd sworn to forget. The dealer's voice hadn't changed. Ghost? Thought you'd cashed out. The motel room stank of mildew and false promises. She sat on the bed, the syringe glinting on the nightstand, Mary's pendant cold against her skin. Outside, trucks growled past, their headlights slicing the curtains. She thought of Gates, his sugar pyramids, his unasked absolution, and Eli's mother, who'd sobbed into Clara's hoodie, snot and mascara staining the fabric. Failure had a taste, metallic and familiar. She texted Derek at 3 a.m., code gray. He arrived with a thermos of black coffee in a silence that didn't judge. They sat shoulder to shoulder as dawn bled through the blinds, the syringe untouched. You stayed, he said finally. That's the math that matters. Gates learned of the incident through a clipped email. Subject: minor incident contained. He deleted it, then spent the afternoon walking the Microsoft campus, its manicured lawns at odds with the chaos in his chest. At a koi pond near Building 8, he crouched, trailing his fingers in the water. The fish swarmed, mouths gaping, and he remembered Clara's description of withdrawal, like being eaten from the inside. That night, he drafted a letter, "You don't owe the world perfection," and burned it in his fireplace. The Phoenix Initiative's annual gala was held in a downtown art museum, its walls hung with abstract oils that Clara suspected were upside down. She'd swap her hoodie for a navy pantsuit, the sleeves tugged low over her track marks. Donors circled with champagne flutes, their eyes skimming her name tag before darting away. Gates arrived late, his entrance a ripple of murmurs. He'd aged since the diner, silver threading his hair, his posture loosened by fatherhood. They found themselves stranded by the canapes, a triptych of distorted nudes looming behind them. "Your speech," he said, "the one about stolen light. You watched." My assistant transcribed it. He plucked a bacon-wrapped date from a tray, scrutinized it, set it down. "I've been thinking about theft, how it reshapes both sides." Clara fingered her pendant. "You think she'd forgive me?" "Mary, she'd have handed you the wallet." His smile was rueful. "Sugar included." The room blurred then, not from tears, but from the sheer weight of the unsaid. A donor swooped in, gripping Gates' elbow, and Clara slipped away, her pulse a staccato rhythm. In the restroom, she splashed water on her face, Mary's pendant clinking against the sink. When she emerged, a teenager loitered by the exit, vintage band tee, shaky hands, the telltale bulge of a stolen purse. Clara approached, her palms open. "Let's get some air." The girl bolted. Clara followed, her heels clacking on marble, past Warhols and Basquiat's, into an alley where the girl hyperventilated against a dumpster. "I'm not like you," the girl spat. "Good." Clara unclasped her pendant, pressed it into the girl's palm. "Be something worse." Gates found her there minutes later, shivering in her thin blazer. He offered his coat, cashmere, absurdly soft, and she didn't refuse. They walked in silence, the city's heartbeat thrumming through sidewalk grates, until Clara stopped outside a methadone clinic, its windows barred. "This where you'd have ended up," she said, "if you weren't you." He studied the graffiti, a neon phoenix, half-scrubbed. "We're all one choice from a different life." The admission hung between them, fragile as a moth's wing. A siren wailed somewhere east, its pitch rising, falling. Clara returned his coat, the pendant's absence a new weight at her throat. "Keep the photo," he said as she turned to leave. "It's earned its place." She didn't look back. Gates waited until her silhouette merged with the crowd, then dialed his assistant. "Double next quarter's funding, and find out who painted that phoenix." Rain began to fall, gentle, persistent, as Clara walked. The city's lights shimmered in puddles, fractured yet bright, and for the first time in decades, she didn't hurry to find shelter. The Polaroid outlived them both in a way. Decades after the diner, the photo hung in the Phoenix Initiative's lobby, enlarged and pixelated under museum glass. Visitors assumed it was abstract art, a golden-hued blur of a woman's smile. The inscription beneath too faded to read. Only Clara, now gray-haired and sharp-tongued at 58, knew to look for the laminate's ghostly ridge along the bottom edge, a scar from another lifetime. She pointed out sometimes to wide-eyed interns. See that? Proof that broken things last longer than you think. Gates' death made front pages, of course. Cerebral hemorrhage at 83, between a climate summit and his granddaughter's ballet recital. The obituaries mentioned the wallet theft as a footnote, a quirky anecdote sandwiched between OS revolutions and Nobel nods. Clara read them in her office, the words blurring as rain tapped the windows. She hadn't seen him in years, their partnership reduced to annual fundraisers where they'd nod across ballrooms, two relics orbiting a shared past. Yet when the news broke, she found herself at the pawn shop turned community center on 3rd Avenue, staring at the bulletproof kiosk that dispensed naloxone kits and hope. "He ever come here?" asked Javier, now the initiative's tech director, his sister's overdose wristband tattooed beneath his Rolex. Clara traced the kiosk's touchscreen, its interface sleek as a spaceship. Once. Try to fix the damn thing when it jammed. They'd argued that day, Gates insisting on AI diagnostics, Clara defending analog backups. In the end, he'd smuggled in a toolkit, his hands steady as he recalibrated sensors. Still got it. He'd grinned, boyish in a way the cameras never captured. The memorial was invite only, held at a lakeside estate Mary Gates had loved. Clara wore her original pendant, the photo charm clouded with age. She lingered at the periphery, watching billionaires and senators sip bourbon, their whispers weaving his legacy into myth. A hologram looped highlights: Windows 95 launch, vaccine drives, the polio eradication toast. No diners, no alleys, no Polaroids. She slipped out during the eulogies, following a path choked with blackberries to a boathouse redolent of cedar and mildew. Inside, between fishing rods and moth-eaten life vests, she found it, a framed replica of the Polaroid, its edges singed. Gates' handwriting beneath, stolen, returned, repurposed. Rain sheeted the lake, erasing the horizon. Clara sat on a rotting dock, her joints protesting, and let the pendant slip from her fingers. It sank fast, Mary's smile swallowed by murk. She'd expected catharsis, but grief, she realized, wasn't a mountain to summit. It was the lake itself, deep indifferent, brimming with secrets. Back at the initiative, a package waited. Inside, the original Polaroid, its laminate peeled like snake skin, and a note dated 3 days before his death. Burn it, bury it, frame it, but stop carrying the weight. She chose the lobby. They rehung the photo at dawn, its glass gleaming. Clients trickled in, jittery, defiant, hopeful, and Clara studied their eyes. One girl, maybe 19, paused before the display. "Who's that?" "A thief," Clara said. "And him?" The girl nodded at Gates' hologram on the evening news. "Same." The girl smirked, a spark in her gaze. Clara recognized the look. Not the hollow hunger of the streets, but the restless itch of survival. She handed her an naloxone kit, their fingers brushing briefly. "Keep moving," Clara said. The girl tucked the kit into her hoodie. "Always do." Outside, Seattle's skyline shimmered, a circuit board soldered with rain. Somewhere below, in the alley shadows and rehab clinics and pawn shop kiosks, the city breathed, a living algorithm of second chances. Clara adjusted the photo's frame, Mary's smile aligned just so, and let the day unfold.